Hello, and welcome to this online presentation, Catholicism in the American Melting Pot. On behalf of the Michael McGivney Pilgrimage Center in New Haven, thank you for your interest as we continue to examine the life and the legacy of Father Michael McGivney, parish priest and founder of the Knights of Columbus. In past presentations, we've looked at Father McGivney in a biographical context. With this session, we'll shift in focus to historical context. Father McGivney was just a grade school student during the American Civil War. The United States during that time was in upheaval, as well as in a period of rapid growth. Population was growing mainly due to immigration. In fact, the Catholic Church in the United States in the late 19th century was predominantly an immigrant church. Catholic newcomers faced religious and ethnic prejudice and dangerous, low-paying working conditions that threatened their families and communities. Today's presentation will focus on how Catholics dealt with these challenges by creating new social, economic, and spiritual supports, like the Knights of Columbus. Today is March 9th, 2022. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the McGivney Center's Facebook and YouTube accounts. Links to those sites are in the resource sheet, which is available for download via the utility on the right side of your screen. Also, you're welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation using the question utility, also on the right. I'll introduce those questions as I'm able after the presentation. I expect that it should last approximately 40 minutes. Joining me today is Dr. Seth Smith from the History Faculty of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Dr. Smith is a historian of Catholicism in the United States with particular interest in Catholic identity and the relationships between Catholics and their non-Catholic neighbors. Seth, I'm grateful for your willingness to develop our knowledge and our appreciation for this significant period in American history. The platform is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I want to thank the Michael McGivney Pilgrimage Center for inviting me to speak with you all today. I especially want to thank Peter for his organization of today's event and his guidance over the last month or so. Beyond that, I'm just really happy to help out a fellow Catholic U alum. Peter, I just want to confirm, is the presentation still showing?
Yes, you are. I can see your presentation.
Okay, great. It disappeared from my screen, and I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. All right, very good.
I'll monitor throughout.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It seems appropriate today for me to give a talk for the Knights of Columbus, given the many connections between the Knights and Catholic University dating back to really the founding of the university. Some of you are here today may be familiar with McGivney Hall, which is named after the Knights founder. Outside that building, you can actually find a statue of Father McGivney. Inside the building, you can find the check from the Knights establishing the Columbus Chair of American History from 1904, which certainly, as a historian of American Catholicism, I'm really grateful for. The Knights had a role in founding the Columbus School of Law, more recently funding the Pope Benedict XVI Chair in Theology. And just off campus, if you could actually see outside my window, you'd see the St. John Paul II Shrine, which the Knights fund. And they've contributed significantly to the construction of the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, most notably the Bell Tower, which is the second tallest structure here in DC. Now for today, what I want to speak with you about is the circumstances in which the Knights were founded. They're founded in 1882, but I'm going to do what virtually every historian does. When you ask them to talk about a particular date, they will immediately tell you you have to go back 40 or 50 years to really understand why this thing is happening. And that's what I'm going to do too. I apologize for that. It's a habit of ours, a bad habit, I suppose. And what's interesting to me is when you think about American Catholicism, you think at the founding of the country, you think of the American Revolution. The Catholic population of the United States at the time of the Revolution, or what would become the United States, was only 1%. Only 1% of the American population was Catholic. We've now reached a point where about 21% of the population is Catholic, and it's more than 4 times bigger than its closest religious tradition. So how does this happen? How do we go from such a small tradition at the Revolution to such a large tradition now? And as Peter mentioned, this process really jumpstarts in the late 1830s, and it starts with immigration. When we look at 1840, you've got 16 Catholic dioceses in the country and 700 churches. As we get to 1860, we have 45 parishes and 3,000 parishes. And what we see with the size of the American Catholic Church is that it grows by 1,300% between 1830 and 1870. Even by 1850, it was the largest single religious tradition in the country, even though it's really still a small percentage of the total population. And there are several causes for this. The annexation of Texas and the acquisition of the Southwest and Northwest plays a role in this in the 1840s. We see American Catholicism including traditions of French and Spanish, as well as white and black Creoles in Louisiana. We see free and slave Black American Catholics, a few Native Americans, which extends from the work of French and Spanish missionaries. We see some French Canadians in the Northeast, in the Northwest, and we see Spanish-speaking people in the Southwest. But the real issue here is German and especially Irish immigration. Between 1840 and 1860, we see millions of immigrants coming from these areas to the US. This period sees about 2 million immigrants come from Ireland, about 1.5 million Germans, and about 750,000 Britons coming to the US. And this is going to pose a challenge to what it means to be America. It's going to pose a challenge to the social structure of America, the political structures of America. Excluding the Britons for a second, because they are mostly dispersed amongst various Protestant churches, what we can say about immigration during this time is that it transforms American Catholicism from numerically one of the smallest American religious communities to the largest single denomination. It transformed it culturally from an Anglo-American community based primarily in the mid-Atlantic, around Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and Kentucky as well, to predominantly an immigrant community in northeastern and midwestern cities. So it's moving the center of Catholicism and who is actually Catholic. Religiously, it's going to transform American Catholicism from a simple home-based spirituality, because there simply weren't enough priests, there weren't enough parishes, and so Catholic life often revolved around the home. So it's going to move that spirituality to a highly organized devotional spirituality that's parish-centered and outward-facing. You're going to move out of the home and into the public sphere. And these changes are going to create the circumstances in which the Knights of Columbus come into being, and they're going to shape its purpose going forward. Now, for these immigrants that you can see here on the map coming in, the Irish are almost entirely Catholic, which is probably not surprising to you. Many Germans were Catholics, although a lot of them were Lutherans as well. The result of this is by the time we reach 1860, 63% of Catholics in America are Irish, and about 15% are German immigrants. So you got 78% of the Catholic Church in the United States is made up of these two immigrant groups. As far as where they're moving, they're mostly avoiding the South. So they're avoiding Maryland, which had been the traditional center of Catholicism in the US, in part because they don't want to compete with slave labor, but they also can't compete with the wealthy landowners who dominates the South's economy and society. So the South is, for the most part, and I'll talk about a few exceptions in a second, mostly not that appealing to them. Instead, what they're doing is moving to the north and moving to the Midwest. We think about the Germans in particular, moved to states in the Midwest and what's referred to sometimes as the German Triangle, the area between, as you can see here on the map, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. The German Catholic immigrants who are coming here they're not in great shape, but they do come from farming and artisan families. By and large, their socioeconomic status is a little better, a little higher than that of the Irish. And a lot of them can actually afford to buy land when they come to the US. And so what a lot of these German immigrants do is they settle in small towns and farming communities in the Midwest, where they were often the majority of the neighborhood. When they actually settle in cities, what they often do is settle in separate neighborhoods. They can afford to buy property there and settle there. And what we find with German Catholics, these German immigrants, is they often keep to themselves. They are not interested in Americanizing or assimilating into the US. They want to hold on to their German traditions, which is why so many German customs become American customs, especially if you think about Christmas traditions. They want to hold on to their language. They want to have separate schools. They want to be in America. They want to participate in the American economic system, but culturally and socially and religiously and linguistically, they want to remain German. They see that as the best way to retain their heritage and retain their faith. The Irish find themselves in different circumstances. They are by far the poorest of the three groups of immigrants that are coming during this period. As many of you will know, Ireland had been under the oppressive control of the British since the time of Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s. And the British depiction of the Irish, which would subsequently become the American depiction of the Irish, was that they were ape-like. They were not fully human. And that their Catholic religion was superstitious and treasonous, that they held loyalty to the Pope as opposed to the English monarch, the British monarch. The importation of Scottish Presbyterians into Ireland sowed seeds of ethnic strife that would last for centuries. And with the Irish, beginning in the 1830s, they began fleeing Ireland. They flee famine caused by severe overpopulation and later caused by a blight on the potato crop. So the potato famine that we sometimes think about. And they're settling primarily in northwestern cities, especially Boston, in part because it's the cheapest place to get to. They can afford to actually get to Boston. They can afford to get to these northern cities. And what they do when they arrive in these cities is they change the religious and ethnic and political makeup of these cities. My students who study American religious history with me, when they know Boston, for example, as an Irish Catholic city, they find it hilarious when they realize that once upon a time, Boston was the seat of anti-Catholicism in America. There's no place less hospitable to Catholics than Boston, and yet that's where they land. And this is going to cause problems in those cities, particularly in Boston. Now, I do want to mention for a second, some Irish do settle in the South, especially in urban ports like Savannah and Mobile and Charleston and New Orleans. And they're able to make a living there, although they're often settling in very poor neighborhoods, very unsanitary neighborhoods. Those who do settle in rural interior areas often end up converting and becoming either Baptist or Methodist. The reason being is they have no access to the sacraments, they have no access to the church, they have no access to a priest. And when you have no access to any of these things, and there's no socioeconomic advantage to being Catholic, they often found it more advantageous to join Baptist or Methodist churches in the inland areas. They also find terrible work in these areas. It's a fascinating thing to look at the Irish experience in the South before the Civil War and find that often their lives are seen as more disposable than that of slaves. And it's not because they're held necessarily in lower esteem. It's that from an economic standpoint, the slaves are more valuable to the slave owner. They've invested money in the slaves. And to have a slave do really dangerous work like dredge a swamp, or build something in a place with a lot of disease, if you lose the slave, you've lost money. If you hire a poor Irishman to do this work, you might have to, and he dies, you might have to pay the widow a little bit of money, but mostly it's not going to cost you that much. So in the way that farm machinery or livestock is valuable, the life of the slave is valuable in the way the life of an Irishman just isn't. So as we look at these Irish immigrants, these Irish Catholics, they're coming to the US, they are typically poor, typically illiterate. The advantage they do have is they generally speak English. And so they are able to find work in that way. And as they move into primarily coastal cities and later on cities in the Midwest, they provide competition for low-paying jobs. The result is that it drives wages down for these jobs. And these are backbreaking, dangerous jobs, both in cities and in the interior. If we're looking at the distinctive features of Irish Catholicism, what the Catholics themselves believed, we see some really key aspects that are going to play a role in what we see with the Knights of Columbus and other groups later on. One is that by the time we reach the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, Irish Catholicism is shaped very much by a couple of things. One is the ultramontane French clergy who fled the French Revolution and later on the political unrest in France. They're going to come to Ireland as missionaries to guide and teach the Irish. The other key figure here is Cardinal Paul Cullen of Dublin. Cullen himself had been primarily raised and educated in Rome. In some ways, he was referred to as more Roman than Irish. But what these two forces do is they take an Irish Catholic population in Ireland, and Irish Catholicism that had a heavy emphasis on folk religion and local traditions. And what they do is they strip some of what was seen as the pagan elements of it, and instead replace it with a more, what we might call, Orthodox faith, a faith that is focused on Rome, that is focused on the devotions of the era. And so they make it more coherent, more similar throughout Ireland. We see as a result a high prestige of clergy in the institutional church, looking to Rome, looking to the priest as the personification of Rome, as a source of truth, as a source of leadership. The priest is going to have the final say on faith and morality. Because priests are held in such high esteem, because the institutional church is held in such high esteem, the church became a means of education and advancement. If you are a young, talented man who is faithful, the church was frankly, a good way to get ahead. You were going to be given a good education, certainly comparable to what was available to you in Ireland and later on in the US. You become a community spokesman, and a leader within the town or the neighborhood, and there's extraordinary prestige. There's such a respect for the priesthood given these elements. What also helps here is there's a chronic shortage of priests. There are not enough in Ireland, there are not enough in the US. And so what we see with the Irish Church, both in America and in Ireland, is a constant call to vocations and a importing of priests from Ireland and from France as well. Now there's also, as a way of dealing with hardships, both in the US and in Ireland, there's a heavy emphasis on devotional life. We see encouragement and, in fact, an uptick in practice of saying the rosary, praying the 40 hours of Eucharistic adoration, devotions to the Blessed Virgin. Certainly, Cardinal Cullen encourages us, instead of, say, political rebellion against the British, what he's arguing for is a renewal of faith, a renewal of devotions within faith life to help the Irish deal with these things. And we're going to see that emphasis on devotional life come to the US as well. The other thing we're going to see, especially, well, in both countries, is we're going to see, because of that ultramontane, which simply means over the mountains, loyalty to Rome, and Cardinal Cullen's loyalty to Rome, we're going to see amongst Irish Catholics, both in the US and Ireland, a deep loyalty to Rome and a deep patriotism to their country, whether it be Ireland or the US. They are going to think of themselves as loyal Catholics, as sons and daughters of Ireland, and when they get to the US, they're going to see themselves fully as Americans as well, or at least try to get there, even as that's being questioned. Now, one thing worth mentioning here, when thinking about that terms of being a good American and a good patriot, essentially, politically, all Irish and German Catholics were Democrats. There are a few exceptions, a few join Whigs. We can think of German Catholics who will join the Republican Party, the newly formed Republican Party shortly before the Civil War. But for the most part, they are solid Democratic votes. As a result, what happens is that Democrats' political opponents, especially the Whigs, who are often evangelical Protestants, they accuse Democrats of buying votes. They do this with bribes, whether it be money or alcohol, as you can see here in the political cartoon from the era, the Irishman with his whiskey or the German with his beer. This is clearly critical of the Democrats and immigrant participation in American political life. That they might bribe them with jobs. And they're accused of stealing elections and running political machines, because this immigration really does change the political makeup of America, and especially changes the political makeup of American cities. Elections that were once contested really are going to become solidly Democratic. And this is a concern for people who have been worried about the effects that immigrants might have on American politics, especially Catholic immigrants. And I'll talk more about the particular political concerns about Catholics in a second. And some of that, frankly, there is some truth to the concern about the bribes. We know that there are political machines that promise jobs. We know that there are votes that are bought with either with money or with alcohol. The thing worth keeping in mind here is that the Democrats were the ones actually taking care of immigrants and actually tending to their concerns in a way that Whigs and other political parties simply weren't, who wished that the immigrants weren't coming. Now, when we think about how Catholics are changing these cities, under the guidance of priests and bishops in America, both French but especially Irish, what the Catholic Church in America starts doing in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s is building a really impressive network of institutions to take care of these immigrants, because these immigrants are excluded from mainstream Protestant social networks. The Catholic Church begins building charitable societies for poor immigrants. It creates orphanages for children, militia companies, parochial schools, which are a key part of immigrant life and Catholic life in America in the 19th century. They build hospitals and political organizations. And again, they're doing this because Catholics are excluded from traditional networks. And remember, this is a time when governments don't take on these welfare responsibilities. The expectation is that this will be provided by families, this will be provided by churches, maybe provided by local municipalities. Beyond simply physical needs, these priests and bishops emphasize the church as the means of salvation and spiritual homeland refuge for immigrants. And this gets put into practice by parish-centered and distinctively Catholic activities like parish missions, pious confraternities, and devotions to the saints. They're used to revive the spiritual life of Catholic immigrants. There is a concern not simply for their physical well-being, and that matters a lot. You have to tend to their physical needs, because as we see in Europe in the 19th century, the church there in a lot of countries doesn't. And the result is they lose many faithful Catholics. But you can't save the body and neglect the soul. And so these devotions, the spiritual life, is designed to help German and especially Irish Catholics maintain their Catholic identity and their Catholic faith. And given the difficulties they face in America, Irish Catholics in particular need the help. What we see is that many Irish Catholics end up among the urban poor, which is considered the bottom 10% of the labor force. They're often temporary workers. They own little or no property. Their jobs are unpredictable, they're seasonal, they're dangerous. They're carrying things, they're digging things. And some laborers have greater job security, but very few prosper. What we see, especially with Irish immigrants, is both parents are working. The father will go outside of the home and do manual labor. The mother will bring in laundry or work taking care of other people's children. Many families are sending their children out to work. Children are working in factories, so children are working in shops. Young Irish women are working as domestic servants. And the thing is, everyone has to work just to help the family survive. And the death of one parent often sends the family into dire poverty. They can't survive the loss of one of those incomes, especially if it's the husband's income. And so we see these benevolent societies, these charitable societies, these orphanages pop up to take care of people who have lost family members, so they don't break into poverty and so the family doesn't break apart. The immigrants who are doing these jobs typically live in well-defined neighborhoods of crowded boarding houses or tiny apartments, often in very unsanitary conditions. The way I ask my students to think about this is, imagine you've got your dorm room, and your dorm room has no window, no running water, no fresh air, and you're in there with your entire family, or let's say 7 other folks. You start to get a sense of how crammed these living conditions are, how unsanitary they might be, and this is a time without plumbing, obviously, or consistent trash pickup. You can see why disease would spread through Irish and immigrant neighborhoods very quickly. And immigrants would get blamed for this as though they were causing it themselves. There was something inherently unsanitary about the Irish as opposed to simply the conditions in which they lived. Now, with living conditions so difficult, with working conditions so difficult, it wasn't unusual for wage earners to turn to alcohol as a form of solace. Because often so many people are living outside the homes. So much of their life is spent outside the home because home is so crowded and unpleasant at times. And so what we see is grog shops and public houses and saloons appearing on almost every block of working class districts and cities. And what happens when you combine alcohol and crowded people who are stressed is we see domestic violence, we see arguments that turn into fights, that turn into brawls, that turn into riots. You see here a cartoon from the era, and it's no secret who is who here. What we consistently see in drawings of the era is the Irish drawn as ape-like, as subhumans, almost trolls, fighting the police, causing violence in cities. Now, this is unfair because they're dealing with difficult circumstances, and people are looking for a problem. And when you combine the violence that does sometimes break out in these neighborhoods, you combine the disease that often emanates from these places because the conditions are so unsanitary, and you combine this with Americans' concerns about the political and cultural and social and economic ramifications of Catholic immigration. And what we see is a rise of nativism in the US, especially in the late 1840s and into the 1850s. A hostility towards immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants, especially Irish Catholic immigrants, although German Catholic immigrants don't avoid this either. And there's a long tradition of this in America. Certainly we can think of Catholic founding fathers like Charles Carroll or Thomas Fitzsimmons, but there's a long tradition of anti-Catholicism in American public life. We can see the anti-Catholic thought of John Adams or Samuel Adams or Thomas Jefferson. They're not shy about sharing their concerns about the Church of Rome. And what we'd seen in the early United States is that a lot of Americans believed that Catholics could not be good Americans. They believed that Catholics were anti-democracy, that they were anti-progress, that they were superstitious, that they were too loyal to the Pope. So there's a question of, could you be loyal to the Pope and to the American government? I love that invariably the Pope is referred to as a foreign potentate in anti-Catholic tracts of this era. And so consequently, when Catholic immigrants started arriving in the late 1830s and into the 1860s, they're met by a rash of anti-Catholicism like the kind you see demonstrated in this picture. And this is not a fringe movement. In 1834, Samuel F.B. Morris publishes The Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, which warned of a Catholic threat to American republic institutions. This is the Samuel F.B. Morris who creates Morse code. He's a prominent American citizen. The other great piece of anti-Catholic literature to come out of the decade is The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, published in 1836, which is a fictionalized account of depravity and murder in a convent in Montreal. The convent existed. Everything else was utter nonsense, but played into anti-Catholic stereotypes. But it sold better than any other American book in the 19th century after the Bible and Uncle Tom's Cabin. As we move through the 1840s and 1850s, anti-Catholic sentiment intensifies. We see mobs of unemployed workers calling for limits on immigration. Other Protestants form what they called Native American clubs, which called for limits on immigration, restriction of public office to native-born citizens, and exclusive use of the King James Bible in public schools. Schools are a huge part of this. Education is a huge part of this because public education in the United States at this time was de facto Protestant education. You take an example of Philadelphia, where the Catholic bishop persuaded public school officials to use both the King James Bible and a Catholic translation of the Bible in public schools. And it results in anti-Irish rioting that lasts for 2 months, that resulted in Protestants facing off against the Pennsylvania militia. That's the fervor with which Protestants are concerned about the Catholic infiltration of schools. And while the Philadelphia riot is probably the worst of these riots, it's not uncommon. In many large northeastern cities, differences of ethnicity and religion led to violence that's split the North in the same way that race and class would divide the South. We see anti-Irish riots in Boston and New York. We see church burnings in a variety of cities. And election days could become full-on battles in big cities. Famously, there are battles between German Catholic Democrats and their opponents in St. Louis and Louisville. Now, in response to this, we see Catholics start to defend themselves. Famously, Bishop John Hughes in New York, or Dagger John Hughes, it's my favorite nickname for a bishop in American history, Dagger John Hughes, urged Catholic men to arm themselves and stand guard in front of every Catholic church. He himself took turns in front of Old St. Patrick's. He threatened to turn New York into another Moscow. Probably the most organized example of anti-Catholicism was the American Party, or what we know now as the Know Nothing Party, because it was a secret political party. And if somebody asked you if you remember, you were supposed to say, "I know nothing." What the party was basically secret anti-Catholic societies banded together in 1852 to form a political party. What they hoped to do was unite native-born Protestants against what they saw as the alien menace of Irish and German Catholic immigrants. They wanted to ban immigration. They proposed literacy tests for the right to vote. Literacy tests are actually not invented to prevent blacks from voting in the Jim Crow South. They're actually a Northern innovation designed to keep Irish and German Catholics from voting in Northern elections. Now, the Know Nothing Party fizzles out pretty quickly in 1856, in part because they're complete amateurs. They're terrible politicians. They know how to protest. They don't know how to govern at all. Their secrecy made them seem as bad as Catholics to a lot of people. And obviously, slavery becomes a much larger issue as we reach the Civil War. And for most of American Catholicism, there are two questions that are really being asked. Protestants are asking can Catholics be good Americans? Can they abide by democracy and freedom and the papacy? Or how can you make all of these things work? Catholics themselves are asking, how can I be a good Catholic and a good American? And the reality is that American Catholics pretty quickly became Americanized, even as they continue to be construed as anti-American. And the thing that proves this is the Civil War. It's the Civil War. And you can see here a very clear depiction, or difference in depiction in how the Irish are being portrayed in America. Generally speaking, and I hate to put it so callously, considering the devastation that the Civil War inflicts on the US, because nothing else is close. But the war ends up actually benefiting the Catholic Church in America. The question of can Catholics be good Americans, or at least patriotic, is answered unambiguously, yes, absolutely, they can be good Catholics and good Americans. Catholics serve with distinction on both sides as soldiers. Both the Union and the Confederacy had about 70 priests who served as chaplains. Approximately 20% of the nurses in the war were women religious. Up to this point, Catholics had never participated so publicly in American life, and they acquit themselves very well during the war. It's unquestioned in both the North and the South. And so after we finished the war, immigration for the next 2 decades, from about 1865 to about 1884, or really 25 years, it continues, and it's significant, but it's not exploding at the exponential rates that it had between 1840 and 1860, or eventually would between 1890 and 1925. What this means is that the nativist anti-Catholic sentiment that we're going to see really flare up in the way before the Civil War and the war, or the way of starting in 1890, it abates a bit. It calms down a bit, even if it doesn't go away entirely. The church is well established on the East Coast, the Midwest, and the Southwest, so it's not facing the problems it had in the early Republic. Catholic participation in the war seemed to demonstrate that Catholics could be good Americans. And so that silenced that question, at least for a while. Even numbers in seminaries are increasing at the time. So a lot of the challenges the Catholic Church had faced since its founding in the English colonies had at least temporarily been answered, except really the economic problems that many immigrants still faced. And so this allows the Catholic Church to do two things. One, it allows it to maintain and expand the church in America. And two, it allows it to turn its attention outward from the parish. To the first point, maintaining and expanding the church in America. Again, I don't want to give you the impression that immigration stopped during this period. Far from it. The Catholic population actually doubles in America from about 3 million to 6 million. About half this growth comes from natural increase. About half of it comes from immigrants continuing to come to the US. And again, the largest percentage of those are Irish. So immigration here is significant, but it's not massive, and it's smaller than pre-war totals. And with the church growing in numbers, it needed to tend to this spirituality of this flock, and so we continue to see an emphasis on devotional practices. But there is also the brick and mortar need. You see here the construction of St. Patrick's in New York. The church if you're going to have this many Catholics, you simply need churches and schools and hospitals and orphanages. The church needs to provide support for working class and poor immigrants working difficult industrial jobs at a time when there is no workman's comp and there is no unemployment relief from the government. It's a period of pretty substantial growth. The second point matters too, though, because the church has grown, the church is confident of its place in America. And so it can start to turn its attention outward from the local parish. And it happens in a couple ways. The first is that you can start developing institutions and organizations with a national focus rather than a local focus. And Catholics can do this because their parishes are secure. They're established. They have enough parishes. They have enough parishioners. They're starting to have enough priests. Their church is probably not going to be burned down. So now what do? How do you project Catholicism outward and evangelize the country. And what some groups do is start linking up with other parishes that share their nationality to create larger networks and institutions. And the Germans, unsurprisingly, are the first to do this. But of course, they're not the only ones to do this. The Irish do this too. And this brings us to the most famous national initiative, the Knights of Columbus, founded in response to and a result of so many of the developments I've talked about over the last 40 minutes or so. As we look at late 19th century Connecticut, for Catholics, it's marked by dangerous factory working conditions that leave many working class and immigrant families fatherless. We see growing fraternal benefit societies created to support these families, and we still do see that lingering anti-Catholic prejudice. It's getting better, but it's not gone yet. And so, recognizing a need in his community, Father Michael McGivney, Blessed Michael McGivney, the 29-year-old assistant pastor of Irish stock at St. Mary's Church in New Haven, Connecticut, proposed establishing a lay organization to prevent Catholic men from entering secret societies that were antithetical to church teaching, and proposed to unite Catholic men and help families of deceased members. The group would be named after Christopher Columbus in order to demonstrate Catholic men's loyalty to their country as well as their faith. And it originally serves as a mutual benefit society to low-income immigrant Catholics. And so what I want to finish today doing is by drawing some explicit connections between these developments I've been talking about and the Knights themselves. So we think about, first of all, Irish Catholicism, the number of immigrants moving to the Northeast, moving that center of Catholicism from Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic to the Northeast. Well, it makes sense that a popular men's fraternal Catholic organization would be founded in the Northeast and by immigrants. Of the first 28 members of the first 28 members of the First Council, 16 of them were actually born in Ireland. It's not an accident that this starts at an Irish parish. And the majority of the first generations of Knights were immigrants. The conditions facing these men are consistent with the conditions facing immigrants across the country. They're working hard, dangerous jobs with little social or financial support. They're relying on the church. They're relying on fraternal support. They are looking after each other. The prestige of the clergy matters here too. Of course, it would be an Irish priest who would take the lead in organizing something in an Irish parish. Father Michael McGivney was born in Waterbury, Connecticut in August 1852. His parents are Irish immigrants. For an intelligent, talented, faithful young Irishman, which he was all of these things, it makes sense that becoming a priest would be a reasonable calling for him. It's an avenue for education and service and leadership that would not have existed otherwise for him. Certainly laymen are crucial to this, but the expectation for a group like this is that the priest would be the leader and the key figure. We also see with the Knights from the beginning a heavy emphasis on prayer and devotional life, and on moral living in response to hardships. From its beginning, membership was limited to male Catholics in good standing at the time of their application. And perhaps to counteract the nativist perception we've seen of the Irish as abusing alcohol, sobriety is demanded of its members. You are expected to abstain. And the Knights have from their founding a focus on men as fathers and as husbands. That focus on taking care of family when the family situation is so precarious for them. Finally, we see with the Knights from their founding a group that is both loyal to Rome and to the United States, as demonstrated by their service in the Civil War. Father McGivney had actually originally suggested the name Sons of Columbus as a name for the order. He wanted to encourage men to be proud of their American Catholic heritage. Columbus at the time was really the best example of a hero who was unassailably American, even though he's actually not American, but he's certainly an American hero, but also unassailably Catholic. In taking Columbus as their patron, the founders expressed their belief that not only could Catholics be full members of American society, but they're actually instrumental in the foundation of the country. And the word Knights replaced Sons because 6 key members of the organization, who were Irish-born Civil War veterans, felt it would help apply a noble ritual in support of the emerging cause of Catholic civil liberty. So that Civil War heritage plays a role as well. In closing, I do think that the order experiences unparalleled success and growth in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries precisely because they were so attuned to the demands of the age. By the end of 1885, so 3 years later, there are 31 councils of the Knights in Connecticut. 9 years later, there are only 5 states in the country that don't have a council. And as we sit here 140 years later, the Knights exist as an important part of Catholics' lives across the world. Peter mentioned this at the beginning, across the world, precisely because so many of those demands facing immigrant Catholics in the late 19th century remain relevant today. So that I will stop, and I will be very glad to hear your questions. Thank you.
Seth, thank you for a very insightful presentation. So much of what you shared, I think, was common knowledge with our audience, but at the same time, the manner in which you elaborated helped us to gain a deeper understanding. I do have a few questions that I'd like to pose to you from the group.
Sure.
You mentioned that there were predominantly 3 Catholic immigrant groups to the United States in this period: the French, the German, and the Irish. Now, there was opposition to Catholics in general, and you elaborated in a particular way about the animus toward Irish Catholics. But I'm wondering about, based on this question, was there a cohesiveness? Was there a cooperation, a mutual support and understanding between these European Catholic immigrants among each other?
Rarely, to be very honest. I mean, because the French predate the other two. The French are coming a little earlier and in smaller numbers. But what we're going to find throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, and really it sticks until almost World War II, is certainly a different approach to how they have viewed America. They're going to stick largely to their own communities. The Irish are going to adapt a little more to American culture and society in a way that the Germans simply are not comfortable doing until about World War I. And result of World War I forced them to adapt a little more and give up some of the cultural trappings, language trappings that they hold on throughout the 19th century. We see certainly far more Irish within the hierarchy of the church than Germans, but we see in the Midwest church, we see a number of German bishops, and we find them being a little suspicious of the Irish bishops and chafing a little bit at the control that the Irish bishops have. The particular devotions that they're interested in don't always work out. Especially there's a lot of division over how schools should be handled. So unfortunately, they're not cooperating as much as it might have benefited them to.
Another question pertained to your mention of Irish participation, in particular in the Civil War. I think you cited it as the first significant Irish participation in American life or American society. That anti-Catholic sentiment, that opposition was eased, I guess, as a result of that. But then later you said that it grew again. What contributed to the return to the suspicion about Catholics and Irish Catholics in particular?
So one thing is we make a bit of an artificial distinction aimed at the ways of immigration. Because we sort of think of this period from the beginning around 1840, late 1830s, through the 1870s as being predominantly German and Irish. And it is. The thing is, the Irish never stopped coming. They're just not coming quite as big in numbers after 1890 as Italian Catholics, Polish Catholics, basically Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe. What happens here is the old prejudices get dragged back up when that next big wave of immigration starts back up. And so as we see Italian Catholics show up, and we see Poles, and we see people who don't speak the language, we see people who have what strikes many Americans even more foreign customs, we see with that increase of immigration starting back up, we see anti-Catholic immigration starting again. And so what happens is you start lumping all Catholics there. And so we get back to falling back on old Irish tropes, if you want to go after Irish. Because by this point, as we reach the beginning of the 20th century, the Irish really have established a foothold here. You do have them moving out of some of that lower socioeconomic status I was talking about in the first half and middle of the 19th century. You see them getting better. So you don't see maybe quite as much aimed specifically at the Irish. It doesn't go away. But you see it aimed at other Catholics, and that kind of brings all Catholics together in building that immigration. It's a lot of it's predicated just on how many immigrants are coming at a particular time.
You mentioned toward the beginning of the presentation about Boston, and you shared that you tell your students that, even today, as we associate Boston so much with Irish heritage, the Boston Celtics, for example,
Yeah.
At a time it was a very anti-Catholic city. Was it by necessity or by choice that the Catholics were moving into Boston? And you also cited the riots in New York.
No, I mean, to be very frank, it's about the cheapest place they can get to. It is necessity. I mean, so they were definitely not going to go to the South. So they were not going to anywhere south of Baltimore is out, because they were, generally speaking, not going to go to a place where there's slavery. Yeah, they do hit some of the port cities, but mostly immigrants are looking for a place with free labor. So they're not coming to the South. And when one simply looks at passage, simply the economics of it, Boston's the cheapest big harbor to get into. And so that's where they end up. This was not a place that is ideal for them in any way. I mean, if you're thinking about the place where they could have potentially gotten the best reception, even though it doesn't really work out that way, Philadelphia, given its history, would have been a more obvious choice, given its history of religious tolerance. And actually, before the Irish start showing up there, it is probably, of all the northern cities, it's probably the most tolerant of Catholics. But there is that concern with Irish immigration as it increases. Philadelphia becomes less enamored of religious tolerance then. But yeah, no, it is mostly just an issue of necessity in Irish and networks.
To be sure, the Irish Catholics made it there, and in particular the German Catholics to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about Waterbury. Now, you mentioned Waterbury as McGivney's birthplace. This is this city almost becomes a Catholic enclave. It was known as the most Catholic city in America. Now, it was a manufacturing city, a factory city. McGivney's father worked in the factory. Michael himself had to work in a factory. He had ambitions to enter the priesthood, to go to seminary at a very young age, immediately at the conclusion of his education, primary education. I mean, they didn't have a structured high school system, a secondary type of education at that time. But I'm curious, why is it that Waterbury would have formed in the manner that it did? And it certainly was not a destination for immigrants. They had to literally find their way to Waterbury from either Boston or New York or another port city.
No, and this, I will confess that I'm not a great expert on Waterbury in particular. What we see traditionally is, I mean, and we see this across immigration history, is networks get established. On some level, word of mouth is what starts to support these things. It's hard to get the community started, but once that community is started, you're able to pass that along a bit, and word gets back. Almost works its way back through the network, through Boston, through New York, and back to Ireland. That this is an opportunity. It also works its way, for Catholics who are elsewhere, not just from Ireland, but from elsewhere in North America. You hear about a Catholic city. You hear about, there's not great work, but there's work, and there's this community. Maybe this is the place where you need to go, or where if you're being pushed out of somewhere, this is the best place to possibly go.
One more question.
Sure.
You talked about these Catholic immigrants establishing, and perhaps even more specifically the institutional church, establishing many institutions that have persevered to this day. We're talking about particularly hospitals and schools, not only a parochial school system, but also many Catholic universities. How were these viewed at the time by individuals who were already living here in the United States? And how is it that if there was a great deal of opposition, that these models actually thrive, these institutions thrived and became models for other institutions to follow?
Well, I would start by saying, what is being, what's being opposed, and I draw a bit of a distinction there. There is a real concern about the schools, less so about the healthcare, about the hospitals and the benevolent societies. People are generally, they were appreciative of the hospitals because there was so little access to healthcare, that these serve an important purpose in cities. And there also comes a moment when you are sick that simply you accept these. And so there may be a grudging acceptance, but there is an acceptance of this. The schools went out for a few reasons. One is sheer numbers. The number of students who are going through these things, eventually you build up popular success. Eventually these cities have large Catholic populations by the importance of which the church places them. Because in many places, especially we see this after Baltimore Plenary Council in the 1870s, there's an emphasis on Catholic education that sometimes you build your school before you even build your church. And so it's a point of pride to hold on to these schools and build them out. And people can see the good they do. They also have a habit of emphasizing vocational training combined with what we would call liberal arts education. So practically, they're very, very valuable. And they're not educating simply Catholics, because they're bringing in so many people who are not Catholic who want that vocational training. So you combine that with numbers, and eventually you get to the point where these things are established. They have financial support from third and fourth generation immigrant families who can now afford to support them, but the church makes them a priority. When we think about healthcare, this is a thing that's fairly successful from the get-go. We think about this, for example, even in southern cities, where Catholic nuns create the second biggest healthcare system in the state of Georgia after the Civil War, which improves people's opinions of them.
I think I'm going to put a pin in it there so that we can bring our session in under an hour. Dr. Seth Smith, I think I failed to mention your formal title, Clinical Assistant Professor and Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs at the Catholic University of America, my alma mater. I'm very grateful. I want to thank our audience as well for their participation and remind them that later this month, the Michael McGivney Pilgrimage Center will observe Founders Day, which marks the 140th anniversary of that formal establishment of the Knights of Columbus. So please continue to follow the McGivney Center's website and social media accounts for information about that and other upcoming events. One more reminder that this session is being recorded and will be available on the YouTube site and on the Facebook page. So if you haven't, you can feel free to download the handout, and the handout will have links to those sites as well as Dr. Smith's contact information if you choose to follow up with him. With that, I will say thank you once more. God bless you, and we will see you next time.